question isn't if you're worshiping, the question is how are you worshiping?
John, I want to tackle our next question here, and it has very much to do with the clip we just heard and the topic that Cheryl Batchelder was addressing. It's about work as worship, and we did a commentary on this recently based on actually another question we received on the Q&A podcast here. So I'll read this because it brings up really the key question behind the whole thing, which is how do we know when we're working and when we're worshiping? This person says, I resonate with your listener's question for our work is our worship. How does work become worship? Is there a specific thought or prayer that must precede the work for it to transform from the routine drudgery into glorifying our Father? Hopkins' quote mentions, everything gives God glory if being in his grace, you do it as your duty. All things give him glory if you mean they should. This big if reminds me of singing in church back in the 60s and being encouraged to sing like you mean it, almost as if my worship didn't count unless I was serious and sincere enough. Such a difficult thing to evaluate if the quality of my worship is sufficient.
Hey, listen, I'm one of those guys that I can sing with all of my heart, and it doesn't count, man. It has nothing
At least
to do.
not to the people around you listening.
No, it is disruptive. It is sincere but terrible.
Make a joyful noise, as it says.
Yeah.
John makes a noise.
First of all, this is just one of those questions that I love because it just reflects so much intentionality and care and thoughtfulness. And this is one of those things, like, jump on this journey and you're going to be grateful, right? Even if you never figure out exactly what this full answer and you're able to articulate it in 2 minutes or less on an elevator somewhere, this is a remarkable journey, and it'll take you to Dorothy Sayers. It'll take you to Steve Garber. It'll take you to so many different people who have thought so deeply about this. But let me just take that very first question, how does work become worship? Work is worship. It doesn't become worship. Work is worship always. Now, it could be bad worship, but this is a reflection of what we would call a Christian ontology, what really is true and real about the universe. And that is that the God who created everything is always, we are always in his presence. This is what the psalmist says. If you go to the heavens, you're there. If I go down to the depths of Sheol, you're there. Where can I flee from your presence?
Coram Deo, everything is before God.
Yeah, that's where exactly where I was going next. John Calvin's line, Coram Deo, which is if you've received I try to sign any books that I sign or thank you notes for people who give to the Colson Center. I often sign Coram Deo, and I hope people are like, what the heck's that? And then they go and look it up because it just means before God. And it's just something we need to be reminded of, that every moment of our lives is before God. Years ago, I was doing a seminar for a group of seniors at a Christian college and tried to really help them wrestle with this very same question about what is it going to mean now to live in light of the reality of what's true, and that is that this world belongs to God and that you're living in his presence. And there's I went through that whole psalm that I just went, where can we flee from your presence and all that sort of stuff. And one of the students was like, that is frightening because that means I'm known. I'm known. I think that I can, put this off or hide this or contextualize that. And you're just exposed before God. And that's a remarkable reminder, not only for the things like, some of our moral failures, like we have addressed recently over the last couple of weeks on the podcast and during this segment, but also because of work. I mean, Dorothy Sayers would say the only Christian work is work well done. Now, to really understand that, you need to read the rest of what she talks about in terms of work, but it's a very important thing. In other words, there's something there about stewardship. There's something there about fulfilling our created mandate, which a lot of people want to jump to the Great Commission and forget that God gave humans instruction from the very beginning, and that's still part of what it means to be human. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. Let us create man and woman in our image, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air. This authority, this stewardship that God has given humans, which again, not to sneak in another plug, but it's what we're going to talk about all weekend at Wilberforce, which is going to be a lot of fun. But this is such a wonderful question. And I would just say it is. The question isn't if you're worshiping. The question is, how are you worshiping? The question isn't when does work become worship. The question is how do I turn my work into worthy worship, for God? And that has to do and this is kind of implied in the question in so many ways: intention, effort, diligence, surrendering, sacrificing, just giving that to God, doing that next thing well. And because let me just read this other part of the question, which I thought was great. Is there anything that must precede the work for it to transform from routine drudgery into glorifying our Father? I mean, look, there's a reason that the church developed liturgy and even these senses of hand motions and bowings, and the idea was to make people realize what you were about to do. And of course, it became superstitionalized, if that's a word, in certain contexts in certain parts of the world, and even in our minds to think, well, it doesn't really count unless I do this or whatever. But that's the point. Is actually more largely is just a reminder, like this is what's happening, not a spell that you cast on it in order to turn it into something. But from the routine drudgery into glorifying our Father. What if routine drudgery is glorifying the Father? What if it's because it's the work, whatever work your hand finds to do it? Yeah. And we live in a cultural moment where we can be a lot more selective. We can say no to this because it's beneath us, or we can say yes to this because it meets our needs or fulfills our passions. Most Christians throughout the history of the world didn't have that. They didn't have the thing to say, well, I don't really want to do this because God made me to be a teacher. What they had to figure out how to do was to use all the gifts that God gave them in whatever the context was, even if it was a context of persecution or routine drudgery. So it has a lot more to do with how we kind of see the world and see God's sovereignty, and to see our place in it, our time and place, our situation as being a station, as the reformers would call it, which is another word for calling. Like, you've been called here. This is not an accident. Yeah, working this shift at this, minimum wage job might stink. Yeah. But this is what you've been called to. So now turn this into worship, or turn this into worthy worship. I'll bring in one last thing. Sorry, you remember when we talked about this last time? I got fired up. I just think this is so fun. This is such an important conversation. Because we have outsourced our cultural engagement to the professionals for DC and Hollywood for 3 decades now, and this is cultural engagement at its best, when every Christian is caring for the world around them in this sort of framework. So I get real excited about this. But there's something that Glenn Sunshine brings up in his series that he's done for our website, Christians Who Change the World. And we can link to that too in the show notes. But he talks about how some of the great innovations in history from entrepreneurs and business leaders, and whether you're talking about guys like Arthur Guinness or the printing press or Gutenberg or whatever, was to take the toil that was part of the curse, the frustrating part of work, the sort of work that maybe animals could do in place of humans, so humans could use higher capacities like thought and so on.
Or
and
machines.
That there's and machines, right? Yeah, to basically redeem. I don't want not the routine, but the toil part of the drudgery, the part that says, like, for example, there's been work throughout history that's just basically killed us, that's just beat us down, and to give that work to machines not only has lifted people out of poverty, raised the living standard, brought good to the world, but it also has, in a sense, turned back that part of the curse. I'm not saying human work forgives us of our sins. I'm not saying that at all. But it can help us alleviate the curse and toil. And this is a gift that Christians have thought, like, oh, I can join God's work in the world this way and bless others, give the good gifts that come from God to non-believers. So anyway, that's a lot, but you got me going. That's super exciting stuff.
It's your favorite subject, or one of them.
One of them, yeah. I got maybe 3 or 4, but that one's one of them, yeah.
Well, this one's, I'm pretty passionate about it as well, and I won't be as long-winded as you were, John, just for our listeners' sake. But But really, this is
surprise.
you mentioned the Reformation, and this is one of those things that really is rooted deeply in the Reformation. I mean, people think of that, and we Protestants go, oh yeah, the doctrine of justification was recovered, and a proper place of Scripture was recovered. But another thing that was really emphasized and recovered in the Reformation was the doctrine of work, of calling, of vocation, and you see the Reformers writing about this constantly. And you see a lot of people afterwards writing about what exactly happened at the Reformation with regard to work, and why did it change our view of things, and why did it sort of remodel economies. And I wrote my capstone paper back in my undergrad days was on this at Thomas Edison. And it was on the question of Max Weber's Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. So unbelieving sociologist, real quick, he theorized that, well, Calvinists work hard because they're trying to prove their salvation, basically, because they don't know if they're predestined or not. So I re-examined that, and in light of the writings of the Reformers, said, no, actually what's going on is that the doctrine of vocation was recovered, and all work became sacred, again, or re-sacralized, if you will. And that meant that that God approved of it. It wasn't profane. Because one of the things that was the emphases lost in the medieval period was this idea that there's not a sharp, hard distinction between the sacred work that the clergy do and then the profane or common work that the people do. That was a parody of a biblical idea, which is that there are senses of worship, right? There's formal worship, which is when the sacraments are dispensed, and when we come into God's presence as His people. That type of worship is really explicitly mandated and regulated by Scripture. But there is another kind of worship, which is our common day-to-day worship as humans. The Westminster Confession says that, another Reformation document says that the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And that means, John, that literally our purpose for everything we do is worship. Even salvation itself is ultimately oriented toward worshiping God. That is our chief end. And that means that work as well is part of that worship. I like to say that the Great Commission that Christ gives is in many ways a sort of servant of the creation commission, or the cultural commission, because it's the means by which we're restored to doing that constant work and worship for God in His presence, and to glorify His name and to enjoy Him. And so as we go out and preach the gospel, we then have this big question, which the Acton Institutes for the Life of the World asked after that, which is, what are we saved for? What's the purpose after this? And the answer is, we're saved to glorify God through being human well. And that part of that is work, because work isn't a result of the fall. You've talked about this. It is toil is a result of the fall, the sort of curse on work that made it sweaty and filled with thorns and futility. That's the curse. But work itself is something we were originally commissioned to do, and which Christians are recommissioned to do in the Great Commission. There's a pun for you. So I think it comes back to getting over this idea that seems so persistent in our minds, that there are two kinds of things. There are there's the worship and sacred stuff you do either as clergy or on Sunday in church, and then there's the rest of the stuff you do, which God doesn't really care about. It's just to put food on the table and money in the bank or whatever. No, He cares deeply about it, because that's the means by which we A, serve each other, and B, worship Him by doing so, by fulfilling that original creation mandate. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here, but it's a really incredible subject. And if you want to see the fervor with which many of these Reformation era writers talked about this, go to Martin Luther, go to Tyndale, go to Calvin, and just read the stuff they wrote about work and about there being no difference between as concerns pleasing God betwixt the washing of dishes and the preaching of the word. They were willing to say things that extreme just because they believe so deeply that everything we do can be pleasing to God. If it's within the bounds of His prescribed will, it is worship, and that's just how it. Yeah.
I'm going to get nerdy philosophical here, because what they were basing that on is a cosmology. They weren't basing it on, a random Bible verse here or there, or a particular take here or there. They were basing it on this fundamental dividing of the human experience that had been part of their culture that they thought was out of line with the creation story. The Bible does not divide the world between physical and spiritual things. The Bible divides the world between the Creator and the creation. And that's a very important thing, because if for example, atheists draw the line between the physical and the spiritual and say the physical exists, the spiritual doesn't. New Agers draw the line between the physical and spiritual and say the physical is an illusion, but the spiritual is what's really real. Christians don't divide the line between physical and spiritual. To go to the image of God question, God formed man out of the dust of the ground, physical, breathed into him the breath of life, spiritual, and man became a living soul. So the distinction in that story is not between the body and the soul. It's between the human, the creation, the image bearer, and the creator. Now, the long-term chaos of this view is important to bring out, because some of our more liturgical or high church, deeply theological minds would say one of the challenges of that is that is the banality of life, the taking of spirituality and de-sacramentalizing it, and would point to, for example, the example that this questioner gave, which was a great question, wasn't it? A great example, which is like, sing like you really mean it, But the idea there is that it basically put all of reality into the physical, right? The long-term consequences. This is what Os Guinness calls the gravedigger thesis. I don't know if he came up with that or not, but he talks about that in his book, The Last Christian on Earth, which is the Reformation took everything out of the hands of the church and made it kind of temporal. And ultimately, you just had a little tiny string that kept connecting it to God, and it wasn't too long before science and technology allowed us to go bloop, and then all of reality.
This is Brad Gregory's unintended reformation, the idea that the reformers unintentionally ushered in secularism.
No, that's right, and it's a historical argument to be made. It doesn't mean that what the reformers were saying was wrong, because it wasn't. It was exactly right. It was basically what happens, and I think what happens when ideas are misguided. So this is going to be the super nerdy point. Where the reformers got it right was not because they took what was temporal and mundane and said this is just as important as the spiritual. In other words, it's not because they de-promoted.
Right.
It's not because they demoted the spiritual to the level of the temporal.
Right.
That's what ended up happening with the Enlightenment and with modernism and secularism, is that the spiritual was demoted to the temporal. What the reformers were actually trying to tell you, and they were talking to a group of people who had to do how did this questioner put it? Where's the phrase? The routine drudgery of milking cows and cleaning slop and all of that sort of stuff. Is the reformers were trying to say, no, that is elevated to the sacred. So they weren't demoting the sacred to the profane or to the temporal. They were taking the temporal and promoting it to the level of sacred. And if we can keep that right, there's no reason that we have to snip the God cord there. It actually then means that we're standing in God's presence all the time, and this has a lot of meaning and purpose. And like I said, jump into this conversation as this questioner. Read Dorothy Sayers on the issue of work. Read Steve Garber's book, an older one called The Visions of Vocation, and the new one called The Seamless Life. That's a great one. If you're thinking about even your own home, there's a book called Every Moment Holy, which offers prayers for what we might call the mundane and the drudgery.
I was going to recommend that one. Yeah,
That's
Douglas McKelvey even has a prayer dedicating the changing of diapers, a couple of them actually, to God for His glory, and it's beautiful. You think it's going to be funny or ridiculous?
No,
you
it's just
read that
beautiful.
prayer, it's beautiful. It'll bring tears to your eyes.
Yeah, and of course there's the actual Book of Common Prayer, which does some of that same thing.
Yes.
But you can also look at there's a book called "Hallowed Be This House," which is a book particularly written for moms. Not exclusively, but is wrestling with the sacredness of the everyday in the home. So there's just a lot of ways to think about this. But thanks so much for that question.
Well, John, what you just said about dedicating every moment to God in prayer is precisely the point of a conversation that I had recently with Kyle Strobel on the Upstream podcast. He's just written a new book called Where Prayer Becomes Real, and the theme of that is really overcoming many of our foibles and worries and bad habits in the midst of praying to God, of coming before the throne of grace, of talking to our Father. And it was just an immensely helpful, practical, pastoral book. And the conversation that I had with Kyle, it was one of my favorites on Upstream so far, because I've been wrestling through this issue of prayer lately, and not just in how we can dedicate all of our lives to God in prayer, to prayerfully work and to pursue our vocation, but also what it means to ask God for things that we may not receive, what it means to come before Him with reverence, but also be honest with Him. And that's one of the key points of the book, is that honesty can transform your devotional life, your very soul. And that's actually the subtitle of the book. So I want to play this quick clip from my conversation with Kyle. You can find the whole thing by visiting colsoncenter.org/upstream.
It's very interesting that many of us assume prayer is a performative act. And by that I mean that what we're doing is we're performing, and we have to make sure we do the performance well. And that alone as an expectation is devastating, because the second the performance doesn't feel like it's going well, and let's be honest, like, most of us don't leave an hour of prayer feeling like, wow, I just nailed that, right? We leave an hour of prayer going, oh my goodness, what has happened? And most of it was sleep, quite honestly. Like, that was a nice nap, and then I thought about my week, and we turn inward, and we begin to kind of think that we need to kind of prod ourselves.